Hello there, and welcome to another Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
Lots to chat about again this week, Chaz, with an end to the standoff over America's House Speaker. That's the good news. Not so good, the looming threat of a new phase of the Israel-Gaza conflict.
We're going to be talking to one of America's most respected Middle East analysts, Michael O'Hanlon, shortly, and we're also going to have more from our guest on this week's episode of Planet America Wednesday, which, in case you hadn't heard, is on at ABC TV at 9:30pm on Wednesday nights.
I had heard that.
Yeah, well, you can hear more. But first...
After more than 3 weeks of leaderless chaos, House Republicans yesterday fell in behind their fourth nominee to replace the ousted Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. After first House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, then Judiciary Chair Jim Jordan, then Majority Whip Tom Emmer all failed to unite the party and reopen the House, the unlikely winner was Mike Johnson of Louisiana.
I want to thank you all for the trust that you have instilled in me to lead us in this historic and unprecedented moment that we're in. The challenge before us is great, but the time for action is now, and I will not let you down. I want to say to the American people, on behalf of all of us here, we hear you. We know the challenges you're facing. We know that there's a lot going on in our country, domestically and abroad, and we are ready to get to work again to solve those problems, and we will. Our mission here is to serve you well, to restore the people's faith in this House, in this great and essential institution.
Speaker Johnson is a man who has made much of his Christian faith, and he thanked God, whose will it was to make him Speaker, he believes. And the hand of Donald Trump was also certainly very clear in this process. The former president scuttled Tom Emmer's bid on Wednesday and was hedging his bets on the next round of candidates.
I am not going to make an endorsement in this race because I could never go against any of these fine and very talented men, all of whom have supported me in both mind and spirit from the very beginning of our great 2016 victory. In 2024, we will have an even bigger and more important win. My strong suggestion is to go with the leading candidate, Mike Johnson, and get it done fast. Love, DJT.
So much love there. But I think we can take it from that not even Trump was sure who was going to be the ultimate winner. What happens next, though, is anyone's guess. Funding for the government expires in 3 weeks. The last Speaker to pass a continuing resolution to avoid a government shutdown was sacked, remember. And then, of course, there's more than $100 billion in Israel and Ukraine aid to be passed. So, Chaz, do you care to venture a guess as to what might be about to happen?
Well, it's a really good question about the Ukraine funding in particular, because Mike Johnson is not a fan of funding Ukraine in the war there. And he made a point in his press conference to say, we're going to stand by Israel and not mention Ukraine. So that's an interesting question. I actually am quite optimistic about them getting a budget passed, because now the Trump supporters and the far right have skin in the game with this guy because they've voted for him. He, before the vote, put out a plan on how he planned to approach the next year. He seems to be a very organised fellow. And part of his plan was, we are going to pass the 12 individual appropriations bills rather than one big omnibus to get everything through. There's no way that they can do that in time, in 3 weeks. And he said, if we can't do it in 3 weeks, well, then I'm going to seek an extension to to January 15 or to April 15, whatever is required. He put that in writing before they voted for him, and they still voted for him. So I think we're going to get that extension, and I think it's going to happen.
He's a man with a plan, which he believes is God's plan as well. He's an interesting guy. Let's talk a little bit about who Mike Johnson is, because if you're at home thinking, Mike Johnson, I don't know that I've ever heard of this guy. Well, you're not alone. He's not particularly experienced. He's only been in the Congress since 2017. He was seated, and he was not in leadership. So he hasn't really upset too many people.
He's the number 5 guy in the pecking order.
Number 5.
Yeah,
okay.
like the 4 above him have already tried and lost. Right. He's the deputy whip. Tom Emmer was the whip. He's the deputy whip. So he's not officially in the leadership group, but is the next best thing.
Right. So he was leadership in waiting, and they churned through the rest. So there he is. He is an interesting person. We're used to some, particularly on the conservative right, using their religious faith as kind of a guiding light to their public life. Mike Johnson seems to be at a whole new level. I mean, we see someone like Mike Pence, who quotes the scriptures in every debate and every speech and every utterance, and lives his life by some very, I guess, prescribed notions of what is appropriate behaviour. Mike Johnson is different again. I mean, he literally believes in miracles. His father was nearly killed. His father was a fireman when he was growing up. He received burns to 80% of his body. He wasn't expected to live. Mike prayed on that. His father survived, terribly injured, but he lived. And Mike believed that was a miracle, and that has sort of helped create his worldview. And he now sees, as an extension of that, opposes abortion in all cases. He is against marriage equality. He's against the teaching of LGBTIQ or gender fluidity in schools. He is a real social conservative.
Yeah, look, I think he's got reason to believe in miracles after seeing the Republicans vote unanimously for a speaker.
That is that is evidence of a higher power. I think that higher power may actually lives in Mar-a-Lago rather than in heaven.
Yeah.
But.
Sure, but look, no, he's definitely a hardcore Christian. There's no doubt about that. It's going to haunt him in some ways. There are some quotes in the books from 2003 and 2004 when America was somewhat less friendly towards gay marriage, and he had some very confrontational things to say about that particular topic. And as you say, he's very strict on abortion as well. I'm sure Democrats will try and hang that round his neck. I don't think he's a culture warrior in the same way that some of the past conservatives have been, like Jim Jordan, for instance. Like, I'm not saying he obviously has the same beliefs as them when it comes to Christianity, but in terms of he's a much smoother combatant. He's not. Let's put it this way. Remember how I was talking about Jim Jordan as never passing a bill in 16 years. All he does is just fight with people. Mike Johnson's the direct opposite. Mike Johnson, he's been there, as you said, 6 years. In fact, in the last Congress, where there's a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, he had 2 bills passed through a Democratic Senate and president. He knows how to work with the other side. He can use the rhetoric, but at the same time, he knows how to actually work with people. Remember how I described Jim Jordan as one of the least effective lawmakers? Yeah. Like in the entire Congress.
Hasn't legislated in the whole time he's been there.
But not just hasn't legislated, but he hasn't even tried to legislate. Okay, by that same system, if you look at Mike Johnson's scores, right, the average is 1, right? By this score, this
legislative effectiveness.
Yeah, legislative effectiveness score. Yeah. Mike Johnson, during this last Congress, just before now, had got 1.134. When Democrats were in charge, he got one. They held Congress in the first 2 years, right? During that, he had a higher than average score as a legislator when the Democrats held the House. He's sponsored 12, 12, and 15 bills in each of the sessions he was in. And he's gotten 4 bills up into law. And so he's been very effective.
Although one of the bills that he did not get up was effectively a federal equivalent of the Never Say Gay laws in Florida as well. So, and one of the the knocks on him is that he is, look, he's a lot more palatable than Jim Jordan. He's not there literally with his sleeves rolled up and, he's much smoother. You would cast him, he's like, Steve Carell would play him in a sitcom. Like Steve Carell, he's innocuous looking, but some progressives see a wolf in sheep's clothing here, and they're very disturbed at the fact that he was an election denier. He was a leading light of election denial, and now he's Speaker of the House. That terrifies some people ahead of next year's election. And he was all in with Trump. Now, whether he defies Trump, whether his lack of experience that leads him into being a leader means that others will be pulling the strings, whether it's Trump exerting pressure, whether it's his fellow Louisianan, Steve Scalise, who didn't really want the job of Speaker. He's got blood cancer. He's a recovering gunshot victim. There are many people that thought that Scalise really didn't want that job, but might be quite happy for Johnson to be there, and he might have a guiding hand for Mike Johnson. And clearly, we're going to have others, including McCarthy, including Jordan, including Matt Gaetz, that are all kind of going to think, Mike Johnson, he's our guy. We can make him what we need him to be. So it's going to be, look, we'll know in a year how he has been.
Yeah, well, we'll probably know in 3 or 4 months.
If there's a government, yes.
But,
a funded government.
I was going to say, on the arch-conservative thing, the VoteView ideology rankings rank left to right. He's 82nd most conservative. He's right in the middle of the Republican Party, essentially. Whereas Jim Jordan was 20th, Marjorie Taylor Greene's 9th. Like, he is...
Who are the 8th more conservative than Marjorie Taylor Greene?
I know.
Look them up. That's your homework. I want to know who they are.
But just to pick up what you were saying, though, about the election denial thing, he wasn't just an election denier. He was arguably the most responsible for Republicans voting to not certify the electoral results. Because when that happened, around January 6th, Trump had his crazy theories, which they just couldn't support. Republicans could not support. They didn't make any sense. They were dumb. No one could support them in good. But then Mike Johnson came along and said, oh, hang on. There's a legal reason why we should not certify. And he put forth what's called the independent state legislature theory, which is that they didn't, that some states changed their laws for mail-in voting and early voting without running them past the state legislature, and so that was unconstitutional. Supreme Court has knocked that down. But it sounds plausible. And 3/4 of the Republicans cited his logic to not.
We should point out that Mike Johnson is a former lawyer himself.
Lawyer,
So he's not crazy town in the way of Rudy or Sidney Powell or General Ellis.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, so Democrats, I think, are worried that he might be an effective enabler of some of the crazy stuff. Like, he doesn't say crazy stuff himself, but he knows how to launder it. And I think that's what they're scared of. I look at the fact that he's got no enemies in the Republican Party at all. That's the reason he's a speaker, because he's got 0 enemies. And if you can get through that sort of den of snakes and you can have no enemies, he must be a smooth operator.
He may be the man for this very moment, Chaz. We will see, as you say, soon enough. But let's head to the Middle East now, because the United Nations has again called for a ceasefire in Gaza. As Israel's ground incursions intensify in the last 24 hours or so, we're now almost 3 weeks after the Hamas massacres in Israel triggered a conflict that is still risking spiralling into a regional conflagration. Israeli tanks have been operating inside Gaza, and air and missile strikes have been continuing in what's being called the largest land operation from Israel inside Gaza in a decade. While negotiators are still trying to secure more medical aid, food and fuel to come into Gaza, it's just trickling in still. And they also want to, of course, get the release of those Israeli and other national hostages inside Gaza. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry is claiming the death toll there has already passed 7,000, with hospitals now losing power. There are fears that the civilian toll is becoming a humanitarian disaster. Humidity cribs are stopping working, premature babies are dying. The United States military is also reportedly being targeted by Iranian-backed groups in Iraq and Syria, with the Biden administration now reportedly weighing retaliatory strikes against them. But Biden's concern is that the conflict could be on the precipice of erupting into what is described as a region-wide tempest. So, Chaz, very, very anxious times for very, very many people right now, but it is still 3 weeks in. Hard to know what to believe and who to believe in what is more than just the fog of war now. It is a fog of misinformation, misleading information and outright lies.
Absolutely. Like, in fact, 17 journalists were killed in the first 11 days of the Israel-Gaza crisis, which that is the same number that have been killed in Ukraine the entire year and whatever it's been over there. The latest count is 27 journalists have died in 3 weeks. So it is just a nightmare for journalists there, right, on the floor. But what we do know for a fact is that humanitarian situation is not good. We know that trucks are going through at the moment, not as many as we'd like, but even on the first day when 20 trucks went through, that's a lot of aid. According to the UN, those 20 trucks amount to 4% of an average day's imports before the war.
Yeah, 20 trucks doesn't help 2 million people very much.
No, it doesn't. And while they're letting aid in, they're not letting fuel in.
Yeah.
And fuel is what drives their power generators. So then there's no power. Hence the hospitals, like the hospitals not being able to run, and the incubators being switched off, and all the rest of it. The IDF spokespeople, for their part, say, well, hang on, if you want fuel, you should ask Hamas, because and they've tweeted out some tanks saying these tanks, they satellite footage of tanks saying they have 500,000 litres of fuel. Ask Hamas for that fuel. And look, and they make a fair point. Hamas is their government. They should be providing the fuel. And like, I don't know if you believe them about the 500,000 litres. I do believe that there are at least some fuel and food and water being squirreled away in those 500 kilometres of tunnels. And no one's really asking Hamas, why aren't you providing for your own people? But regardless, it doesn't matter who's at fault. They need food.
Yeah.
And they need fuel and they need energy.
None of that is getting in. Meanwhile, nobody from Gaza is getting out.
Yeah.
The borders are shut, including into Egypt as well. So, this would ordinarily have triggered a refugee crisis, a mass exodus, after the orders from Israel came to essentially evacuate the north of Gaza, and so people were pushed south out of their homes into southern Gaza. But now attacks in southern Gaza, which was meant to be not officially a safe zone, but it was meant to be safer than the incursions happening in the north. Suddenly, people are trapped like bees in a bottle. And clearly Egypt is prepared to send some aid in if it means they don't have to let more refugees out, but they certainly don't want millions of potentially pro-Hamas Gazans coming into Egypt, because Egypt have their own concerns with Hamas and their links to the Muslim Brotherhood, and how this could destabilise them as well. And this is where there are just so many pieces at play.
And the fact there's no release to the pressure of everyone being crammed into the south means there's so much more pressure on their hospitals as well. Our Shifa hospital generally has a capacity for 700 patients, currently treating 5,000. That's not sustainable.
No, indeed not. Let's get some more analysis for you now from Michael O'Hanlon. He is a senior fellow and director of foreign policy at the Washington think tank, the Brookings Institution, where he specialises in defence strategy and national security. He's also author of numerous books on warfare and military strategy as well. Michael O'Hanlon, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. Great to have you there.
Thank you kindly. Nice to be with you today.
I want to ask you about the objectives of both Israel and Hamas in a moment, but what would you say right now would be the objectives of the United States? It seems to be that they're kind of, on a number of fronts, trying to keep a lid on things, trying to stop things getting out of control. I imagine there's more to it, though, than that.
Well, that may not be a bad summary of the American objectives, I mean, I think for a lot of us, it feels like the world is sort of coming apart. And we don't need a multi-front war. Israel doesn't need a multi-front war. Making sure Hezbollah and Iran don't get into this mess is huge. Trying to keep some of the diplomatic momentum with Israel and certain Arab states would be nice, at least to be able to maybe restore that in 2024, even though it's certainly been set back for the moment. So I think damage limitation really is sort of the mantra, really is the slogan. And I'm not sure there's a whole lot more to it than that. People are thinking through, what does it mean to essentially destroy Hamas? What does it mean to realize Prime Minister Netanyahu's vow that if you're Hamas, you're a dead man? Is that really literally possible? Is it literally desirable? Those are the kinds of questions being debated. But I think most people have accepted Israel is going to do more and more, including on the ground, to make sure that Hamas does not run the Gaza Strip any longer. I think this is regime change, to harken back to an expression we all used 20 years ago in the debates about Iraq and Afghanistan. I think Israel's decided that Hamas cannot be left in power in Gaza. And the basic concept, the basic bargain that sort of was implied in the last 5 to 10 to 15 years of live and let live, Hamas decided that wasn't good enough for its own interests. And so Israel has decided it's no longer acceptable for Israel. And whatever comes next, and whatever level of complete annihilation of Hamas may or may not happen, I think Israel has basically decided this group cannot be allowed any longer to rule the Gaza Strip. So to me, that is the starting premise of any other conversation. And the United States probably accepts that premise, but then wants to minimize the loss of life, the tragedy for the Palestinian people, the fallout for Israeli-Arab relations, and therefore for U.S.-Arab relations, and also the opportunities for Iran to exploit this, including with Hezbollah. So, that's a long way of saying the way you asked the question was exactly right. This is about limiting the damage and controlling the risks, controlling the conflict. That's the preeminent concern.
Michael, let's say Israel manages to take out Hamas. What are the realistic options for what happens to Gaza then? Could the UN take over like they did in East Timor?
Well, that's a great question. And I like the fact that you've asked that, because my first answer was sort of fatalistic. The best we can do is not to do too much harm. But maybe there's almost an opportunity here. And maybe the opportunity is to break out of the stalemate that Palestinians and Israelis had created together, especially Hamas and the Netanyahu government, where the peace process was defunct and dead. And maybe there's a way to sort of jumpstart it or leap ahead to a situation where a UN trusteeship is established and it goes straight to a Palestinian state in Gaza, with no prejudice as to whether that Palestinian state in Gaza would potentially join with a West Bank Palestinian state. Maybe we don't have to figure that all out right now. Maybe we spent 30 or 40 years trying to figure out the perfect answer, and maybe now it's time to take a step-by-step process. And if you could actually get a Palestinian state with a non-Hamas government in the Gaza Strip, for all the terrible tragedy that we've seen the last few weeks and all the loss of life, it would be certainly at least some partial redemption out of the situation. So I'm hoping people are thinking creatively about how to take a crisis and turn it into an opportunity, to paraphrase the famous slogan. And I'm not sure the odds of that being successful, but I hope people are going to try.
I wonder, Michael, are there, when it comes to the United States and its objectives to avoid a conflagration and major escalation, are there red lines that could be crossed, a major provocation along the lines of the Hamas attack on Israel that could draw the United States to itself become the agent of escalation?
Well, it's an interesting question. And let me start. To be honest, I don't quite know how to answer that question, but I will begin by saying I'm a little nervous that we have 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm not necessarily against it, but I worry about a slippery slope, a gradual decision-making process that leads us into conflict, perhaps against Hezbollah in the future, when we never quite had a clear moment of decision. Sending the carriers to be in position sounds good, but being in position for what? What's the scenario? What's the actual military utility of striking against Hezbollah or Iran? And so I'm a little bit nervous about what we might do next as a United States. I think our best bet is to do what we've done in most previous Arab-Israeli wars, and that's to support Israel with resupply and certainly with diplomacy. But I don't know that we could fight Hezbollah any better than the Israelis could, and I'm not sure why we would want to. And so that's sort of my starting point. It's not even a bottom line policy view. It's just an expression of nervousness that I worry that by sending the carriers into position, we've sort of half made a decision about using force, which may or may not really be ever in our interest. The implication is, obviously, if Hamas unleashes a major series of attacks against Israel, that we're in a position to try to help quell or silence those attacks with our air power on those carriers. But realistically, I'm not sure how well we would do. And realistically, I'm not sure we want part of that.
Michael, it seems there isn't much attention being paid to Qatar at the moment, even though they fund Hamas 3 to 5 times as much as Iran does, and the Hamas leaders are currently chilling over in Qatar even as we speak. Why is it that the Lindsey Grahams of the world are always talking about attacking Iran and not Qatar?
It's complicated. Qatar has been a difficult partner for the United States in many situations, but it's also taken its fair share of grief from the Saudis, from the Emiratis. It's sometimes been seen as not kowtowing to the great Arab powers. That doesn't mean it was always pro-peace or pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, but Qatar has occupied an interesting place for a small little country where it's sometimes actually been trying to calm things down in the region, but as you say, also been trying to sometimes stoke things up. But I think a lot of Qatar's money has really not been for Hamas per se as a military organization, so much as Hamas as a government of the Palestinians. And a lot of the money that's flowed in has been for the well-being of the Palestinian people. But I think what we're going to see now is a recognition, certainly by Israel, but maybe even by other countries, that that basic concept didn't work. And it sort of, in a way, allowed your question to be asked in the way you asked it, which implies that what Qatar really wanted to do was to fund violence. Whereas I think what Qatar really wanted to do was to support the Palestinian people. But at this point, it's no longer plausible to entertain the same compact that we've been all collectively tolerating or supporting for a long time. Hamas is no longer a semi-viable government for the Palestinian people in Gaza because it's decided that it's not willing to live in peace with Israel. And in fact, it's not gradually toning things down over time. It's gradually, and now actually very rapidly, ramped them up. So Qatar is going to have to rethink its basic relationship with Hamas and probably no longer view it as a reasonable vehicle by which to support and help the Palestinian people. I hope that's the conversation happening in Qatar right now. To the extent that Hamas leaders are in Qatar, that's unacceptable, and we should make that clear.
Michael, how do you expect events to be affected by the fact that this is happening on Joe Biden's watch? We've already seen the very empathetic way that he treated the Israelis after October 7th, but of course it was famously said of Joe Biden once upon a time that he's been on the wrong side of every major foreign policy decision in the last half century. What role does Biden have to play here, and how do you assess his performance so far?
Well, I'm not a universal supporter of President Biden, but the quote that you just paraphrased by Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense, I'm a fan of Gates, but that was an entirely unacceptable comment, which Gates then repeated over a period of a decade. And it was a cheap shot. It was clearly something about Gates not liking Biden, and it was unfair and wrong. There are a lot of conversations about Iraq, for example, where Biden actually contributed constructively to the conversation. I think Biden got Afghanistan wrong. I think the pullout was a mistake, and he's made other mistakes too. But that particular form of commentary about Biden is almost like a Republican talking point, and it's not serious. So I really wish Bob Gates would retract it rather than have it be the basis for conversations like the one we're having now. In terms of how Joe Biden's done overall in his foreign policy, I wrote a piece last year saying 2 cheers for Biden foreign policy, because on Ukraine overall, he's done pretty well, helping the Zelensky government stay afloat and alive in the early going when Russia attacked, providing a lot of assistance, not as much as some would like, but a lot more than others would allow. Galvanizing an international effort to really rally to the side of the Ukrainian people. And on balance, I think over the last 20 months, Biden's done pretty well. He's going to have to think hard about where this war goes next. I'm not sure he's got the answer figured out, and I'm not sure he's articulating a very clear vision for the Ukraine war to the American people. But the overall approach to supporting Ukraine, I think, has been very good. On China, the other big problem or question we have in great power relations, and I know one you think about a lot over there in your part of the world, and I think, by the way, the United States benefits enormously from having Australia as an ally and counselor and friend. On China, what Biden's done, interestingly, is actually to keep a lot of the Trump policies on tariffs and other things, and only gradually mollify or modify them. And on balance, I think that's been more right than wrong, because we know that China, I don't think it's an evil empire or an enemy, but it's certainly a rising power with a lot of ambition that's been acting in a pretty assertive way. And the Biden team has pushed back pretty well against that in an interesting display of quasi-bipartisanship in the United States, where we don't see that too often. So let me start with just those 2 big issues. But I think that overall, Biden has gotten both Russia and China more right than wrong in his years as president, and therefore it's Bob Gates who should be apologizing for his assessment, not the other way around.
Michael, Israel now has a unity government, so why are Israeli settlers still committing, well, they're even committing a greater number of outrageous attacks on West Bank Palestinians than they used to? Now the far right aren't in charge. Why is this still happening?
Well, I'm not going to say anything nice about Israel's policy towards the West Bank. And I completely sympathize with Israel for the innocent victims of the October 7th attack. And I completely sympathize with the Palestinian people, especially the innocents, obviously, for what's happened since to them. but we don't have to, one doesn't have to choose to be all pro-Israel or all pro-Palestine. I'm pro-Israeli people, I'm pro-Palestinian people, but I'm anti the Israeli government policy that has supported settlements for such a long time in a way that's made the West Bank basically a non-viable entity for a future state. And I think a lot of that's going to have to be rethought. And we should, I think, be on Israel's side completely in demolishing Hamas, but at the same time, have the simultaneous thought that Israel needs to be pressured to change its policy towards the West Bank. I have really no sympathy for what Israel's done there. And I'm willing to say I completely support Israel in trying to dramatically weaken Hamas and completely disagree with the Netanyahu government on its settlement policy. I think you can have both those thoughts at the same time.
My final question, Michael, is to get your thoughts on what you think is most likely to happen next. In the last 24 hours, we have seen the largest ground incursions from Israel into Gaza in the last decade or so. We still have a humanitarian crisis, a lack of aid flow into Gaza. We have more than 200 hostages whose lives are also in immediate peril. What happens next, do you think?
Well, what I hope happens next, and what may be possible, is that Israel does things like what it's doing right now, ground incursions with specific goals and then a pullback, and do a few of those and call it the siege, declare that to have been the ground intervention, and then ask the world to help push Hamas out of power in favor of a more legitimate Palestinian coalition that is perhaps initially supervised through a UN trusteeship and then moves on to a Palestinian state. And therefore, Israel never has to do the full-bore ground invasion or occupation. That's the gut instinct of what I'm hoping for. It may not prove realistic, and it may not be something that Israel is willing to countenance, but I think it might make more sense than an all-out effort to completely demolish and exterminate Hamas, which is probably not a viable proposition. The main thing is to make sure that Hamas cannot rule Gaza in the future. And there hopefully are a number of ways to get to that outcome without a huge future fight.
My final question, Michael, is surely the biggest problem for Palestinian civilians right now is that they're locked in a war zone with nowhere to go. Why isn't there more pressure being placed on Egypt to allow refugees to escape?
I'd like to see pressure on everybody. And sure, Egypt is one of the countries that could help more, but Egypt wants to pass the buck to Israel, and Israel wants to blame Hamas, and everybody's blaming each other. And meanwhile, 2 million Palestinian lives are at risk. I think the idea of slowing down the ground incursions, partly so more humanitarian relief can come in the near term, is the right answer. And then, as you say, everybody should play a part in resettling refugees, in otherwise helping the Palestinian people. I think there's a way to perhaps see where we are right now as already past the culminating point of the battle. Maybe we can already start to envision a way to start to ramp down. It's going to partly depend on the decision of Hamas leadership and maybe Qatar and others who have been friendly to Hamas in the past to recognize this group can no longer be left in power. And it's going to be partly on Israel to recognize that it can't do what it vowed immediately after October 7th and track down and kill every single Hamas leader or even fighter. There's going to have to be a new, more creative mechanism for getting to a post-Hamas Gaza Strip. And I think Egypt has a role to play, but everybody else does too.
Great to get your insights, Michael O'Hanlon. Thank you so much.
And thank you kindly.
OK, let's get a bit political. And with 374 days until American presidential election day, but only 79 days until the presidential primaries start, here is how it is shaping up. Former President Donald Trump miles ahead of his rivals still for the Republican presidential nomination. A 46-point lead in the average of national polls. His lead in first to vote Iowa, 33 points, and 31 in second to vote New Hampshire.
Yeah, but this early stage, what matters most, John, is whether your campaign has enough money to survive.
True.
And right now, Biden is miles ahead, unsurprisingly. Then there's Trump, And then there's more daylight. Tim Scott started off with a huge war chest that he's quickly frittering away. Nikki Haley might be about to go past Ron DeSantis from the looks of things there. Finally got Mike Pence, who's hovering dangerously in what I like to call the Doug Burgum zone.
You don't want to be there.
You certainly don't. But maybe Mike Pence's campaign is just about to catch fire.
Really?
Just look at Mike Pence campaigning in Iowa this week. Oh, dear. He appears to be campaigning pizzerias. And he's not exactly getting their hearts
People like
racing
pizza, though,
either.
Chaz.
They do,
Get
but
the
that like
pizza
Mike
lovers, mate.
Pence. Look at those people. But he's also in pharmacies as well. Look at this. That is certainly one way for Mike Pence to keep people away from places they might buy contraception.
That is old-fashioned retail politics in a pharmacy. Meanwhile, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley is doing a bit better at the moment in the polls. She is gradually overtaking Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to become Trump's closest but still very distant rival. In fact, Trump has even given Nikki Haley a new nickname.
Bird brain.
Yeah, not one of his better efforts, I don't think. If Trump wasn't facing 91 felony counts in 4 separate cases, you'd say that he's already the presumptive Republican nominee. In fact, he probably still is. Joe Biden is, of course, effectively unchallenged for re-nomination by the Democrats as well. If we look at a head-to-head poll against Trump this week for Joe Biden, it is a tie. It's still a tie, interestingly, if you put independents Robert Kennedy Jr. and Cornel West both into the mix. If you take West out, though, Joe Biden's in front. If you take Kennedy out, then Donald Trump is ahead, Chaz, and that could become very significant around about next November.
It could, except there's no way on earth that RFK and Cornel West are going to combine 17% of the vote, I reckon.
Ross Perot got 19%, Chaz. Funnier things have happened.
But I do think Biden's got some problems. Like, for instance, look at Bloomberg's state polling at the moment. In the swing states, he's behind in Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin. There's a tie in Michigan, and he's only ahead in Nevada. Now, until now, they've been his strongest states, the swing states. But we're actually starting to see him fall behind in them as well. And that is a real concern for Biden. And it's all related to the economy. Across the key swing states, 49% of voters said Bidenomics is bad for the economy. Nearly twice the share who said it was good. And by 14%, they trusted Trump on the economy rather than Biden.
Yeah, it's an interesting moment for Joe Biden because there's not a lot he can get done without the control of Congress that he had in his first 2 years. He can't get a lot of these big spending bills on domestic priorities done. He's got a bit more power on foreign affairs, and we're seeing that with his handling of both the Gaza and the Ukraine conflicts right now. But the old axiom is that people don't vote on foreign policy. Just ask George H.W. Bush, who was enjoying 91% approval after they booted Iraq out of Kuwait and still a year and a half later managed to lose an election to Bill Clinton because of the economy. So it is ultimately, if the economy doesn't kick up in the new year, then Joe Biden is in real trouble. Democrats still clinging to this notion that Donald Trump is ultimately unelectable, though, so we'll see about that.
We will. Now, I know we're running short of time, so I just want to flag one thing. The debate is coming up in a week and a half, and if you look at the people who've qualified so far, Chris Christie, Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley have all qualified. Vivek Ramaswamy is making noises that he might not do it. I think he will. But
He's just being a mini-me Trump. Oh, I may not turn up again.
That's right. But Mike Pence has reached the polling threshold, but not the donor threshold.
Gee, that's tough.
Tim Scott has reached neither threshold. So there may only be 4 people in the debate, and Mike Pence and Tim Scott might need to reevaluate their campaigns. Mike Pence might head back to the pizzeria, I reckon.
Yeah, exactly. They don't want him in Iowa either. He's only getting 1% in the latest Iowa polls. If Mike Pence can't do better than 1% in Iowa, he ain't doing better than 1% anywhere in the United States, I don't think. But now, while the Biden administration has been publicly in lockstep with Israel in recent weeks, reasserting Israel's right to defend itself from Hamas attacks, some Democratic members of Congress have been more outspoken in favour of the Palestinian cause, including the only Palestinian American in Congress, Rashida Tlaib. This week on Planet America, we spoke to fellow Democrat House member Ro Khanna about his party's general support for Israel. And we also asked him about possible House reforms to allow more bills to come to a vote in the wake of this whole speakership crisis. And we even slipped in a cheeky question about his reported presidential ambitions. And watch for this, because his answer was rather enlightening. Here's Ro Khanna. And Ro Khanna, quite rightly, there has been a huge amount of attention on the Republican Party's disunity. But I wonder, though, on your side of the aisle, how are House members feeling about the Biden administration's full-throated support of Israel in the war with Hamas? There are some dissident voices in your ranks, some pro-Palestinian voices, but it does feel as though it's kind of all in for Israel right now.
Well, how could you not stand in solidarity with Israel when you had a terrorist attack that took the lives of women, that took the lives of babies, that took the lives of kids? And all we're saying is that they have the right to bring those Hamas terrorists to justice and the perpetrators to justice. Any country would do that. The United States, Australia, India. If you have an attack where 1,300 of your citizens die. But we have also said, I have said, the president has said, that we cannot cut off, there can be no cutoff of electricity, food, fuel, humanitarian aid, that any military operation needs to be consistent with the Geneva Conventions and the law of armed conflict, taking all reasonable care to prevent civilian casualties, that there needs to be monitoring by the State Department and international agencies to make sure that those military operations are in fact doing that.
Now, Congressman, it seems to me the Republican Party is actually two parties in one at this point in time. And the only reason they haven't broken apart is because the American system as it currently exists punishes you if you're a third party. So Republicans have got to kind of stay together to be competitive. Is there any practical reform that you could see occurring that could change the system to make it work better?
I believe we need to have a political reform that I've laid out, get rid of PAC and lobbyist money, make sure that members of Congress, if they have majority support, can bring in a bill, make sure that you don't have members becoming lobbyists, have term limits for Supreme Court justices. I think we need a wholesale reform. Don't have bills that are multiple subjects, have single subject bills so people can vote on what they want. The main thing is, though, allow a majority to bring to the floor what is popular. I mean, if you have 80% approval for gun violence and you've got 260 members of Congress who want to do it, allow that to be brought to the floor.
Now, Congressman, there's an extremely complicated procedure called a discharge petition, which allows a majority of the Congress to pass a bill without the permission of the Speaker. Could the Democrats potentially run the Congress from the minority using the power of their unity?
It's possible, but it's an exaggerated power because it takes, I think, 3 months before you actually get something onto a vote. It's very hard to do. Very hard for a Republican to sign that and not invite a primary challenge the next day. So theoretically, it's possible. But in my 7 years in Congress, I haven't seen it used a single time.
Finally, Ro Khanna, supporters of Bernie Sanders last year were hoping that if Joe Biden didn't run for re-election this year, that you would run for president next year as a progressive Democratic presidential candidate. Well, Joe Biden is, of course, running next year. So are you considering running for president in 2028?
I'm enthusiastically behind Joe Biden, and I wasn't going to run in 24 regardless of the circumstances. I think Joe Biden is what's going to win in 2024 and won in 2020. But in 2028, look, I think there's going to be a lot of new generation Democrats, and I'm excited about the next generation. The fact that I'm part of that conversation is great. We're going to have a new generation of leadership in this country, and I'm looking forward to what that new generation is going to do.
Well, thank you for essentially announcing your campaign for president on our show. We do appreciate it. Ro Khanna, thanks for your time today.
Thank you. Take care.
And that, Chaz, is it for another Fireside Chat. Do join us, though, for Planet America on ABC TV, Wednesday nights, 9:30 p.m, and anytime you like on ABC iView, YouTube or Facebook.
And there'll be another Fireside Chat next Friday on ABC News. And do not forget the Pet Podcast and all the usual pod places. A lot of Trump legal stuff to talk about today. I'll see you there.
Bye-bye.